And without further ado, Herwig, I think it's time for our main topic where we'll be detailing issuance platforms.
Yeah, obviously a pretty critical component to the industry, right? It's something that even though we've had 25 episodes in the past, have yet to really do a deep dive into. So we felt it only fair and useful for all of you listening to get more of a deep dive into the subject. Specifically, Kyle, maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview of what do issuance platforms do?
Absolutely. These platforms are responsible for actually tokenizing the assets and securities. And so many people call this process, or they're akin to calling it securitizing an asset, which is where we get the names for issuance platforms like Securitize or Securency, which we mentioned in this episode with their fundraise. When in reality, what you're doing is actually just creating a digital wrapper for your securities. In fact, issuance platforms are not typically responsible for actually structuring the investment itself, but specifically they're the technology provider for the digitalization of the investment, which could be a company's shares, a fund's limited partners' interests, a special purpose vehicle, or really anything else that could be considered a security. And in some of those cases, sometimes a special investment structure is required to make that asset actually investable for investors. For example, you might have assigning the ownership of a car to an entity that will then tokenize the ownership in the entity to represent the ownership in the car. This is something that we've even seen with the realty platform as they tokenize an LLC that actually owns the home, and then you own shares of the LLC, and that's kind of how they do the pass-through. There's a lot of examples of that.
In fact, this is something that I'm glad you brought up, Kyle, because this is where a company like Security Token Advisors is often enlisted to help figure out the structure before you even tokenize. And as you just highlighted, I think with realty is a great example. In some cases, you may be required to use their specific investment structure, but really, it really doesn't come down to the investment. It's about the tokenization.
Absolutely. And so that's the role that the issuance platform plays. But in terms of the technology that they provide, they use technology to create a token representation of a specific security, or the smart contract specifically that operates the token. So there's a couple pieces there. The tokens also need to be issued to a wallet. So the issuance platform will help with not only issuing the token, but then setting up the wallet and maintaining that investor platform. And in order to facilitate that, you also do need compliance technology as well in terms of working with different jurisdictions, onboarding investors from potentially all around the world. And the next thing you know, you essentially have a digital deal room for investors. So the platform usually offers some kind of crowdfunding tool or technology on top that allows you to onboard those investors. And then finally, for post-issuance, the issuer needs to manage the tokens, which is typically done by an exclusive software that's created by that issuance platform. And sometimes they can also handle some of those voting or dividend issuance, those kinds of pieces as well. And so now that we've kind of run down essentially the basics of what an issuance platform does, I want to ask you, how do they differ? What's the difference between a lot of these different pieces? If they all do the same thing, let's dive in a little bit on that.
Yeah, for sure. The first example, and you really rooted it down to, what is an issuance platform does at its core is they tokenize, right? So if you're going to tokenize something, at the core of it, you're going to need a blockchain or a distributed ledger technology. And so in this case, oftentimes the blockchain technology that you use determines a lot of the factors, for example, the smart contract languages and the capabilities that they offer, transaction speeds and time, the infrastructure risk or transparency and privacy issues because you're either using a public or a private blockchain. And there's actually, from an other end of the spectrum, a tokenization platform, as you pointed out, uses smart contracts to do the actual tokenization, but they also have technology to help, issue those tokens. So in some cases, on the other side of the spectrum, you have issuance platforms that can support multiple blockchains and multiple smart contract solutions to help issuers tokenize their assets in different ways. So I think whether, to give you some examples, You have Ethereum, Stellar, and Tezos, as public blockchains where you can actually natively issue your own tokens on. So if you happen to know how to program on these blockchains, you can take advantage of pre-written libraries and issue your own tokens. But at the end of the day, it's going to be an issuance platform that has likely developed a platform on top to make it easier for an issuer who most likely doesn't know anything about the blockchain, let alone how to program on it, and doesn't have the time or investment to go out and build out an entire technology solution to tokenize and manage that token once it's issued moving forward. So, we do also have private examples like Hyperledger and Cortazar 3 of private blockchains, which in turn could offer you potentially more flexibility and privacy. And so you have kind of this ongoing debate just right there dividing up issuance platforms. But even if you can choose a blockchain ledger, which in this case Ethereum is the most commonly used blockchain protocol to issue security tokens on, you still need to develop those smart contracts that represent the tokenization as well as the different rules that are written into it. This goes from both functionality as well as following regulations, doing transfer restrictions, making sure a wallet has been verified for their identity and is compliant, if you will. And these protocols also can vary based on the jurisdiction and the like. So we have examples where we see, US-based protocols like the DSO protocol and ST20. Then you also have, for example, the T-Rex protocol by Tokeny focused on Europe, and then you have the C shares and Dharma, but you also have ERC 1404, which is sort of this standard open source example. So you not only can you approach Kyle differently between the blockchain ledger technology, but it's also the software, if you will, the smart contracts that are developed on top that are critical to representing the actual tokenization of the asset. And as we have just discussed, the jurisdiction in itself will have an impact. And what we see a lot of the time is issuance platforms tend to either focus on the region that they're located in, the jurisdiction that they're located in, and making sure that they can issue securities compliantly where they operate. Or they tend to focus on the U.S. because the U.S. is the most robust financial market and it does enable access to global investors as well. So you can issue both to U.S. investors as well as globally without necessarily having to be a U.S.-based company.
Right.
The features, finally, Kyle, are of course also super important. Issuance platforms can focus on different asset classes and therefore they might have different functionality. Many standardize things like voting and on-chain payments, but others may focus more closely on the transactions, which may include debt and equity, or even, for example, there is an issuance platform out in the Middle East focused on making sure that the tokens and bonds they issue are compliant with Sharia law so that Middle Eastern investors can actually participate in it based on their criteria, right? So this is a unique example. And then we have, of course, the user experience, the classic sort of how do I manage, and the ease of use of the software is, of course, going to make an impact when it comes to if you take an issuance platform with the same blockchain, using the same smart contract protocol, focused on the same jurisdiction, they still may very well differ dramatically in how easy it is to use their product or simply in their price or their business model. One may be a subscription, one may be an upfront fee, one may be free. They all vary dramatically across the board, and therefore that is definitely an impact. But the last thing that I think makes the most impact on an issuer when it comes to considering what an issuance platform is and which one should I choose is they, of course, consider the liquidity support. Many choose tokenization as a way to make it easier to manage and transfer the asset over time in order to create liquidity and a marketplace around it. And therefore, of course, where liquidity is supported for these tokens is also extremely important. The best way, typically, the way this is looked at, to look at some context, is if you look at a protocol, where are tokens that have been issued on that protocol currently trading? In this case, Securitize is one of the leading players and they issue, for example, all of the tokens that are currently trading on OFN, but have partnerships announced with many other marketplaces, and therefore you might presume that Securitize may have a better liquidity support because they're already trading tokens on third-party marketplaces. But really what we're talking about is exchanges having to basically vet the smart contracts behind the token, making sure that the token technology itself can work with the exchange's technology. And once that sort of has been gone through and approved, it makes it easier to onboard future tokens from that protocol. So you can imagine right now there are dozens of different of these smart contract protocols in the market today, but there are only so many exchanges and they only have so many resources to support onboarding tokens. In fact, some cases, tokens may not even be using a public protocol. They may have self-developed and custom coded the smart contract, and of course this in itself takes time for the exchange to then onboard and vet whether they can compliantly list the token. And so of course all of that differs based on the issuers as well.
So to wrap all this up, I think that we both made some specific examples that are going to be interesting to compare, just for brevity's sake. And so I have two here that I think are interesting to compare back to back. And these are two issuance platforms that did launch pretty early, and they're both leveraging tokens, native utility tokens in their systems in order to facilitate issuance. And so before we even dig into it, the first thing I want to say is that these are certainly not all of the issuance platforms. There are hundreds of them around the world. These are just some interesting examples that we're picking here to use. Certainly don't take this as guide of whether who you should use or who you shouldn't use. That obviously needs to come down to you and your personal asset decision making. We certainly also have security token advisors that helps a lot with figuring out what's the best platform to use. But first off, I'm going to compare Polymath and Ravencoin. And so when we're looking at a company like Polymath, they are leveraging their own security token standard, the ST20, and offering compliance compatibility with the Ethereum blockchain. But it's a centralized company. So Polymath, they launched an ICO, they raised a lot of capital, and they've built their issuance platform behind that, and they're continuously upgrading on that, both with their compliance protocol as well as with their investor passport and trying to improve on the UX. They do use their Poly token, POLY token, that is native with their platform in order to power the issuance itself. So that pays for a lot of the fees, and that also allows for transfer and payment across borders and things like that. When we're comparing that to Ravencoin, you have the Raven platform, the RVN token as well. Unlike Polymath, Ravencoin is an issuance platform, but it's a much more open source protocol. And so with an open source protocol, one that's decentralized, if you will, they need that utility token in order to cover the fees associated, because there is no centralized party that's actually profiting and powering this thing. So it's a very interesting comparison between something like a Polymath that's very centralized and Ravencoin, where it's supported by a very strong developer community that works together to build this network, but it doesn't necessarily have that centralized presence to drive the network forward that something like a Polymath does. So in terms of comparing those two, it is very interesting to see two different issuance platforms leveraging a token, but in slightly different ways.
And I think that's a great example, because those two are examples of protocols that use another token, a different token, in this case a utility token, to function. We have other examples like the DS20 by Securitize that basically can function without necessarily relying on a third-party utility token and just uses Ethereum's gas to function the network, and they charge their fees privately, directly through the company, much like you would interact with a software as a service platform, as opposed to directly going and programming on ST20 or on the Ravencoin network. And I think another example that is worth looking at is then you have something like Vertala, which doesn't necessarily have its own token protocol, but its issuance platform is designed to support multiple issuance use cases, and therefore could be seen as more flexible and scalable, and gives control to the customer in terms of who they want to use. And whereas some of these other companies, another example being Harbor, they have their R token protocol, but they also have a broker dealer. They have a platform designed all around this to be designed as an end-to-end solution, so you can just go to them and get full service across the board. T0 and many others are also structured like this. And I think finally, another great example to share with everybody that I think is very unique is, and it was covered in the Harvard Business Review, but it's the two-token structure, waterfall structure by Fluidity, which is another issuance platform. And they enable essentially creating a protocol that allows you to issue debt, but it's collateralized by equity that is also tokenized. So in the case of a default, programmatically, the investors will retain ownership of the equity.
Wow.
And, that's a major use case because, of course, when that usually happens, you have a lot of lawsuits flying left and right. You may have the issuer, the developer reluctant to immediately hand over equity. So now, really from an investment risk perspective and the like, you can now control it a lot more and make it a lot safer for investors. So it's examples like this that I think we're going to see niche use cases. We're going to see issuance platforms that are really across the board and focus on price and feature. And then we have jurisdictional focuses and even the technology of the blockchain behind it that may have a radical impact on what ends up being successful. But you can see that even though everybody has the same value proposition, there are really 1,000 different ways to go about it. And we expect the market to continue to see even more new entrants and for these companies to evolve as the market gets more competitive.
And on that note, I think we've covered a lot about what an issuance platform does, some examples of unique issuance platforms that are doing things differently from each other, some fun examples, and we really covered a ton of news this week. Herwig, I think it's been an awesome episode, and I think we can call it a wrap there.
Let's call it. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you again next week.